He is everything to the Transformative Justice Coalition, but also to think that you walk in the steps of Reverend Reed, who they killed, a white minister who they killed for marching, and they also killed Viola Lizoso, a white woman who had come down from Detroit to help with the march. All of this, you are reminded about Jimmy Lee Jackson, who didn't get the march because they killed him, and it was his death and his slaying that inspired the entire march from Selma to Montgomery. Who would have known? I just want people to know that when you do that march, it is something that is not just walking, it's transformative. Your heart gets on fire. Don't you think so? Edward, did you feel that?
I absolutely did feel it, but I want to go back to something you said, and you mentioned the death being the thing that sparked the march. And I want to go a step further and say that it was the hatred of the country. It was the hatred of people who didn't see us as full citizens. It was the hatred of people who thought that rights were a privilege. It was the hatred of people who wanted to stop the advancement of black people that really kicked off the march, because at the end of it all, we have folks who went across the bridge, 600 and some odd folks who went across the bridge at that time. But we look today, 59 years later, and we have some 20,000 and 30,000 people crossing the bridge because we want to maintain the hope that was bestowed after a lot of our folks have stood up against a system that said that we were not worthy to have rights bestowed upon us. And Vice President Harris talked about it. She says that this is not something, rights are not something that can be bestowed upon you, or not something that can be given to you, but it's yours by birth and by right. And so for us, when we walk across that bridge, every single year, the moment right there reminds this country that we are not fighting for privileges. We're fighting for what is rightfully ours. We march so that we never forget. And as we do this work, it's important that we continue to keep in mind all of the thousands of people, the thousands of our ancestors who fought to make sure that our rights were rightfully due us and the generations that come after us. And I think the dangerous part that has been set is that now we have the same government, the same political system that's working against us as we move forward. And so now more than ever, we've got to continue to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I can't wait for the moment when we march from Selma all the way to Montgomery. I think that's absolutely necessary, and I'm excited for that moment to come.
And that moment will come. Yes, go ahead.
And listening to you speak about that experience of going across the bridge, you sort of came from a unique perspective, and that is, not simply because you're a Gen Z, but because you've had the opportunity before you even went to Selma, Alabama, to actually meet and talk to one of the original foot soldiers in the person of Betty Boynton, who was only 16 years old at the time that she actually participated in the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And then before you get to the bridge, you also have the opportunity to meet some of the other original foot soldiers at the Foot Soldiers Breakfast prior to going on. When you had the experience to listen to Betty Boynton, for her to share with you what it was like for her to everything she went through prior to going across the bridge, and what she went through going across the bridge, and what she experienced with the horses coming into the communities and everything else, did it all then come together for you when you were at the foot of that bridge?
My.
Yes. Because I put myself in the shoes of those foot soldiers, and put myself in the shoes of folks like my grandmother, who at these moments stood there. And for them, it was about more than a piece of legislation. It was about simple human dignity. It was about the rights of individuals. And so when they stood right there, and I think about the horses, I think about the police officers, I think about the federal government, I think about the state government, and all of these folks operating and working to stop the crossing of the bridge, that says a whole lot, because in that moment, In that moment, they had to come face to face with, I may not make it across this bridge. I may not make it back home to my family. But that's because everything in this moment is so important and it's so necessary that I'm willing to sacrifice my own life so that those that come after me have access to the ballot box, but have access to full citizenship in a country that's continued to fight against their humanity, and in a country that now continues to fight against the humanity of our folks. And so in that moment, they had to make a decision that after seeing the horses, after seeing the guns, after seeing the dogs, after seeing the water hoses, after seeing the uniformed policemen attempting to stop them from crossing the bridge, they made a decision in that moment to say, you know what? We're going to go through it. We're going to march, and we're not going to let nobody turn us around.
And,
Before
and what
I
I want,
slave, I'll be buried in my grave.
my, and I want people listening to learn one thing that we learned from Betty Boynton that kind of gets lost in the telling of the story of the crossing of the bridge. Now, we always are shocked at the courage, because when you crest the bridge, you still got a ways to walk. And Edward is correct. They could see the people with the with the billy clubs, and they could see the dogs and the horses, and they could see those angry Alabama state troopers ready to beat their heads, but they kept marching. But what we don't know is that after they beat people on the bridge, they chased all the protesters who they didn't get to beat initially. They chased them into the city of Selma. And Betty was running as a 15-year-old girl. And they had a guy, one of the troopers was on a horse trying to run her down. And they were running people down and beating them in the city itself. And so people, you got to imagine, that's like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 blocks that they also were beating people all into the city. How cruel, running your horses through homes, going into homes, dragging people out and beating them. That story is not well known, is it, Daryl?
No, not at all, Barbara. And, it's one of those things where when you get an opportunity to actually talk to the original foot soldiers and they start relaying the actual narrative of what happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and immediately after the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that's when you start getting into the parts of that history that are just untold, that we don't hear about. And so you're absolutely right, Barbara. So when we hear about people banning books and trying to ban Black history, that's the part that we start losing, and we and it doesn't become as appreciated as the efforts should be, because it was incredible bravery and courage for all 600 of those foot soldiers that went across that Edmund Pettus Bridge, Barbara. So you're absolutely on point on that.
Yes, and I also wanted to talk, Edward. One thing that people don't know about that crowd, when they line up the march, they always try to put the foot soldiers and, quote, dignitaries up front. But also, people don't realize that in the major crowd, because you were there, and beautiful Ashley Shannon and Andreas Kabilos and Drake Smith and so many of our people, Quincy Robinson, and then, of course, people like Sean and others, Bryson Towers and so many others who showed up. What was beautiful about that crowd that people don't understand is that people are there. They only come because they want to be there to salute that bravery, but also they're thinking about the future, because you'll see a lot of young people. In fact, the crowd is predominantly younger, but also you'll see people with baby strollers, people with their children in tow. They're thinking about the future, aren't they, Edward?
Of course, I think in every moment it's about the future. There's not, and that's a unique position that young folks in this country have to be in over and over again. We have to constantly think about the future because we're matching it up against the past and the historical practices of the past say that if we don't stand up and think about our futures, those of the rights that we've had in the past can be stripped away from us. The humanity that we fought for could be stripped away from us. And so being future-oriented all the time as Black people in this country is, I would say, a trauma response, because we know the historical atrocities committed by the government. We know the monstrosity of people who hate us because of the color of our skin. And as long as they have power, we have to continue to fight simply for our humanity and our citizenship. And so it's imperative that we continue to be future-oriented. And so I don't think that we as Black folks can afford to not think about the future, because we have got to make sure that every generation that comes, we've got to progress more than we've done before. And so it's necessary. In fact, it's almost for survival that we continue thinking about our future, because we've seen the past. We see the present and we feel the present. And so the future has got to be determined by our actions. And if we don't take a stand for the future, then we risk going back into the past.
There's just so many questions.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, you were on the ground. You were in there with the thousands of people that were marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And you were also handing out placards with John Lewis saying, "Protect our vote," for people to take the placards across the bridge with them, as well as buttons. Were there any experiences that you had with the people with whom you interacted that were noteworthy, that just sort of stood out in your mind?
Oh yes, I think one of the most noteworthy experiences was seeing the younger brother of John Lewis, who stood in the crowd, and he expressed how seeing his brother posted on the signs and everything, seeing his brother posted on the buttons, for him, it reminds him of his brother still being here with us. And when we talk about the spirit of John Lewis, the spirit of John Lewis is among the entire group of people who are within the crowd going across the bridge. And I think one thing we thought about was when we saw John Lewis on the poster, it's as if we're taking John Lewis across the bridge with us just one more time. And so every year we're going to take John Lewis just one more time. But to have somebody there who shares the same bloodline with John Lewis, not only are we taking his picture across the bridge one more time, we're taking his blood across the bridge one more time. But that was one of the most noteworthy moments. I think another one was when we had children who stood at the bridge and they asked for, they would call it a placard or a poster, and they say they want a poster. And then we would ask, do you know who this is? And the young people were like, at first they didn't know. And then we gave the name, John Lewis. It's John Lewis. And they said, oh, right, I know who he is. We're learning about him in school right now. So the spirit of John Lewis is spreading throughout the generations. And so for me, that was one of the most noteworthy moments as well, because not only did we experience, or did I experience, the brother of John Lewis, who was a completely different generation, I got to experience some of the younger people who understood who John Lewis was, and that was a whole other generation. And so passing on the torch and the baton throughout the generations, that for me says that, yes, we are in the fight, and we don't plan on stopping no time soon, because just as long as hatred is being transferred throughout generations, the fight and the resistance is going to be transferred throughout generations, so long as we educate our folks. And I think that it's important that we do that kind of work, because when we talk about the voter suppression tactics and everything that happened, it happens in one way by way of voter miseducation. So making sure that the generations beyond us that come after us understand the work, then we can effectively push back against voter intimidation or voter suppression practices by making sure that 6-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds understand the necessary fight that each of us have got involved in.
And, you know, it's so critical. I want to make one note before I go to another point, but I want people to understand those signs, the posters, the placards, that was designed by one Daryl Jones. When people are saying that they wanted the buttons, those buttons were designed by one Daryl Jones. You'll say, wait a minute, isn't Daryl a lawyer? Yes, he's a lawyer, but he's a creative force and a strategic genius. I also want people to understand that that we actually, if you look in some of the pictures, you're going to see people wearing blue T-shirts with the picture of John Lewis on that. And the Transformative Justice Coalition, because we gave out hundreds of T-shirts for free to people so that they can carry John Lewis. Those T-shirts, Daryl, I was so tickled that when we first set foot in good old Selma when we were at the